RCR with Paul Brennan.
Remember, go to www.realitycheck.radio/digital ID to say no to digital ID. That's where you can sign the petition. Paul G. Conlon is a Queensland-based father, author, professional engineer and freedom advocate whose recent book, you can see it right there, Citizen One, The Case Against Digital Identity, addresses the historical lessons of government overreach that we should have learned but maybe haven't, inspired by his family's survival of Nazi Germany's identification policies. Paul brings a unique historical perspective to the urgent challenges posed by centralised digital identity systems today. He also provides more practical and tactical commentary, discussing ways people might protect their privacy and autonomy in a world where digital ID and surveillance are more widespread. Paul, thanks for beaming in from Queensland. Nice to have you. Nice to meet you.
It's my absolute pleasure, Paul. Lovely to be here.
Okay. I'm curious to learn a bit more about your family's story, identification policies. I think I know what that means, but maybe have that historical perspective first so we can measure something against from direct family experience, and then we'll get into the discussion points for our chat.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Paul. So I talk about my particular family history in 1930s Germany, but I guess to start with, it's important to recognize that these patterns of centralized, powerful bodies controlling identification within a society, that's a very well-trodden path throughout history. So I speak of that era because it has particular relevance to me, but it's important to understand that it's by no means unique. And a lot of the lessons we learn through history keep coming up time and time again. And I think that's a very valuable arrow in the bow, so to speak. So yeah, I have German heritage. My grandmother was a young teenage girl living in a town called Ratibor, which at the time was right on the Polish border. And I grew up kind of hearing some of her stories about that era and learning, I guess, without even knowing it, some of those valuable lessons about what happens when the balance of power, the balance of the knowledge of the population shifts towards the state. And so she heard the tanks roll through her town, unexpectedly into Poland in September 39, and she was viscerally there at the outbreak of the Second World War. And like many families in Germany, they were thrown forcibly into the uniform of the armed forces of the day, much to the criticism of history. But because the state knew very much about who everyone was and where they were, there were certain expectations under grave threats, of course, that you complied with the regime of the time. And so Germans were very much a victim of that oppressive, tyrannical regime, as were the brave people on the other side of the borders of that war. And perhaps people colloquially kind of or generally understand that era in history very much wrote the book on how to weaponize human identity. And in my book, I go into great lengths about how technology accelerates and automates a lot of the oppression and inevitable judgments that come from identification. But that's a bit of a history, and ultimately some of the lessons. I mean, my books are 233 pages or so. It's hard to condense, but some of the lessons are very universal. And one of the key takeaways from that era is that identification inevitably invites judgment. That's the core reason why we're told to identify, is to make some sort of assessment of components of our identity. Well, I'm sure we'll get into the kind of age verification thing that's topical at the moment. Age is just one component of human identity that's very granular, and it's extremely dangerous when a state becomes the sole arbiter of that identity.
Yeah, that pattern that you say is there for probably thousands of years, as long as we've been sort of organising ourselves, trying to centrally, well, what is it? Have some kind of central database or central knowledge base that whoever's in power can access for whatever reason. Obviously, the further you go back, the less technology there is. And maybe in the 30s they were approaching they weren't at the singularity at the 30s, but we might be now.
Look, it's devastating what technological capabilities exist today. And it's one of the points I labor in my public work. In the 30s, we were talking about analog equipment, we were talking about punch card technology, and we were talking about a restructure of the data that governments hold on their citizenry. That was very new. In fact, there's a gentleman, I use the term loosely, he was a lawyer actually from Freiburg named Erwin Kunst. And when the regime took power, he wrote a personal letter to Hitler actually and proposed a restructuring of citizen data. So up until this point, there'd been census information collected quite extensively for some time, and that served sort of statistical and planning purposes quite well. But finding an individual was not a primary purpose of that system, so it was a needle in the haystack type search. And Kunst proposed that if you want a regime that has total control, you need to restructure the way that you hold data. So that he proposed what's called the personaliteits principle, or the personage principle, effectively that reorganizes data from a geographical index. So basically everything was known based on the household, and people would move households and the data wouldn't follow them. And instead indexing it on the individual, so that what the state knows about the individual moves with the individual throughout life. And that was, of course, immediately adopted, and there were various approaches that were innovated at the time in terms of big data, because no state had ever held something to that granularity and that size before. And what was possible with 1930s punch card technology, I think history is there to show. Bear in mind too, those technologies were very susceptible to the physical world. So physical documentation, paperwork, punch cards, they could be victims of bombing campaigns. In fact, there were some documented cases where the punch card technologies that were heavily used, the machinery, were actually enshrouded in bomb-proof bunkers so that they could continue operation during Allied bombing raids. That's how much the state valued their ability to process the information data of the population. Now, all of that goes out the window when we talk about modern digital technology. Now, we tend to have an association between digital and better. You and I would remember the transition from kind of VHS tapes to DVDs, and how digital was touted as higher quality and better resolution, and all of that is very true. Everything about the modern world is based on the infinite, lossless speed of light communication that digital data brings to us. But like everything in engineering, as in life, there's a trade-off. And I make the argument that when you merge powerful, timeless digital systems that know no bounds, whether they be geographical or chronological, with human identity data, which is very much the opposite. It's not binary. It's infinitely nuanced. We change throughout our life. We contradict ourselves. We evolve. We grow. A human identity does not fit well with, binary digital representations. And when you try to do that, what you do, as I said before, is you invite invariable distortions in judgments of who we are. And those distortions in judgment can travel at the speed of light and have impacts in various unrelated areas of life that we just can't predict. So it's a very perilous time. And I just hope we come to our senses about what we're proposing here before we get too entrenched.
Yeah, the sell of what the latest that we're talking about now, this under 16s ban, social media Australia, again, patterns. It's being sold as it solves the problem. Do people agree that that's actually a problem that needs to be solved? I guess we have to start there, do we?
Yeah. So there's a few ways to gauge that. Effectively, what you're asking there, I think, is this a genuine response to public demand?
Yes.
And public demand has a tell. When you go out and about in your daily life, you hear people talk, you're embedded in different conversations at the petrol pump and the grocery store. And I don't know about you guys over there, but I hear a lot about cost of living pressures. I hear a lot about housing and immigration and corruption, the stability of our democratic voting systems. I hear a lot about that anecdotally on the street. Not once have I heard someone say the biggest problem in their life is having too much freedom on the internet. So in Australia, would say it doesn't pass the pub test. It's that we're being sold an issue that you can't actually see evidence of with your senses in the street. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is I would say that it's unique in a way. This is one of those binary issues, and by binary issues I mean it's a go or no go. It's not a relative piece of policy like you may discuss lighting in a park, where you balance up kind of costs, you balance up, whether the light shines in someone's house, and there are different competing factors, environmental considerations. These types of identification of powerful digital systems are a go or no go, in the same way that healthy societies don't debate what the right amount of murder and rape is. They're just binary questions. These are safety critical go or no go situations, but we're treating them in a very relative sense. We're saying, well, let's introduce this infrastructure, and it is infrastructure, it's technical and social infrastructure, civilization changing infrastructure, actually. And we'll justify it by carving out this nice ornamental sounding justification, which is fairly easily dismissed. And I think, again, talking about patterns, quite demonstrably the case that it's quite susceptible to scope creep as well. So from where I'm sitting and from the conversations I've had, I don't see a groundswell need for this. I see actually a lot of talk about the parental obligation to actually assist children around some of these draconian measures, which I think is quite an interesting topic, and fundamentally one that encroaches on the right and obligation of the parents to hold sovereignty over the stewardship of their children into mature adulthood. That is not an area at all that the state should be involved in. And when you start abdicating that decision to the state to determine readiness in whatever way, whether that's based on age or appropriateness, you don't get competence at the end of that process. You get compliance.
It's also the state saying to parents, essentially, we don't trust that you can do the job.
Well, I would argue that it's in no way their purview to make that assessment.
Yeah, but they kind of are.
Yeah, well, they are, and this is where the discussion we're talking about gets quite philosophical. One direction I like to go in is to zoom out a little bit, because it's easy to get kind of stuck in the legislative details, and you're invited down that path of compromise on what I've described as an absolute binary issue. I think we've lost, and this is perhaps something that Australians and New Zealanders have in common, way back to the ANZAC legend. We hear about the legends of Gallipoli and our military campaigns, and, we celebrate ANZAC Day. But I think some of the fundamental pillars upon which we at least used to derive a large amount of national pride out of those legends are being lost socially. And one of the key components of the ANZAC legend, as I like it, and as I will teach my children, is the fundamental concept that we are born on the premise that we solve problems, grassroots problems, on the ground. Where societies have issues, that's the best kind of area to observe what those issues are and to come up with unique and bespoke solutions. As soon as you start to centralize what is quite a distributed set of parental issues, you never get it right. And so, yeah, the ANZAC legend, one of the components of the ANZAC legend is that concept of the rejection of authority, of people who put themselves up on legislative pedestals and say, oh, I have the answers that you don't. And it's more one of, we solve the problems on the ground. And of course, as I mentioned, there's plenty of kind of revered military stories along those lines. And I do have a particular story from Tobruk, if you'd like me to share it, that illustrates that well.
But I would say, interesting comments you make there, because my perspective on that, because, we've got the ANZAC legends here, and grandfather fought in the Second World War in New Guinea and all that, actually as a captain in the Australian Army, as it was back then. I always thought, and people of my generation, slightly older than you, but maybe you share this, that that legend would ensure that we never kind of stepped over any sort of line ultimately. But it turns out it hasn't been enough.
Yeah, look, I think that's a universal truth. And I've had these types of discussions before, and I resonate with what you're saying. It's a very uncomfortable thing to hear, isn't it? When you understand that the nature of liberty is very fragile, you can imagine cupping your hands around that eternal flame, and every generation has a solemn duty to at least preserve the amount of liberty that they inherited from the gallant men and women before them, and pass it on to the next generation. It's never the case that these battles will be lost. Like I said, identification is a well-trodden path, and there are many ways that tyranny rears its often very attractive head. But that is the nature of the challenge before us, I suppose. And by us, I mean those who are engaged in the noble pursuit of the preservation of liberty. There's the tree of liberty, as the founding fathers said, must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is the nature of the game. And I think therein lies a little silver lining in what is otherwise can be quite a depressing topic. The human race has faced many existential grave challenges over its long and tumultuous history. And we happen to be writing this particular page in the soon-to-be yellowed pages of the history books. This chapter will just one day be another tale that people in the future look back upon. But our great opportunity is to rise and unify against something that affects us all. And identification cuts through every dimension in society. It truly does affect us all. So I think we should not see this so much as a burden, but as a great opportunity to actually rise to the mature stewards of society that I'm sure we can all be.
Okay, that story you're going to tell us about quickly.
Well, I think it's just one of those classic flat power structure examples. It's the type of social structure that we're abandoning very much by giving the power of identification to the state. So in Tobruk, the Australians there, colloquially known as the garrison, the Rats of Tobruk there, on the 10th of April 1941. This comes from the 224th Battalion, which was a battalion of Australian men under Australian command. Mm-hmm. And they were digging trenches, defensive trenches. And this one day on the 10th of April, this rather, pompous, formal British artillery officer comes out to inspect the men, inspect the line, and he has beautifully polished shoes and his Sam Brown and pistol belt, and he has an adjutant there, and he's pursuing this line of walking along this line of Australian diggers who were showing him no regard whatsoever. For Australian men under Australian command, it meant very little. They had a job to do, and they were doing the job. And this British artillery captain actually couldn't take it anymore, and he walked up to this one digger and cleared his throat and said, "I've heard you Australians are a rather undisciplined bunch, but surely you know enough to salute an officer." And this digger stopped what he was doing, leant on his shovel and pursued, looked this officer up and down. He calmly turned around, put his shirt on, did the buttons up, tucked the shirt in, and turned around again for the first time, revealing his epaulets and his rank as major.
Right. Okay.
And the blood drained from this captain's face, and then it was the Australian's turn to talk. And he said, "As you can see, Captain, I'm a major, and I outrank you. And furthermore, I'm the commanding officer of these men, and they don't even salute me, let alone you. So as I outrank you, you can stand to attention and salute me." And of course, the Brit snapped off his best salute. And then the Australian just dismissed him with "Now get lost." And the major turned around, took his shirt off, and continued digging with his men. Now, there are two takeaways from that I think are very relevant to the social divide we have at the moment. The first takeaway, and this story rippled through the 224th Battalion and is even obviously being told now 84 years later. It's one of those classic timeless tales. To the British captain, it was absolutely inconceivable that someone who held such a higher rank would be found doing something as lowly as digging with his men. Yeah. But equally, to the major and his men, someone who comes along and prioritizes in a time of difficulty formality and a recognition of his status above someone else was equally inconceivable. They had a job to do, an important one, and they were busy solving the problems on the ground. So I think that just really speaks to the divide that we're staring down now. Yeah, we're pursuing the reverence of authority and hierarchy above everything else, when that's not the DNA that built the culture we are lucky enough to enjoy today.
Yeah, that's very well put. I know exactly where you're coming from. The question here is, and I guess we probably can agree, that there is an issue with under 16s, what's the word, being prey, falling victim to, being vulnerable to what happens in that sort of age group cohort on social media platforms, whoever, whatever they are. That's one thing. And parents, many parents are aware of that already and are probably dealing with it. Some aren't, and they're outsourcing. That's a problem here. So we can accept that there is a need to fence off, do something to protect vulnerable young people. Now, I could be corrected on that, I don't know, but that's what everyone says, and there's a certain amount of common sense in that. It's a question, though, of how you do it. There's a real worry. Do you think it's fair enough? And I think what you've been saying already, I think I know the answer to this, that this is kind of a way to get people on board ultimately, a centralized digital identity system, whatever that system is, whoever runs it, where the databases are, etc. And this is really, well, it's not a misdirection or a diversion, but the real issue with this is not just under 16s accessing social media, but ultimately how you end up identifying your very self in every situation.
Well, it certainly smells like that, doesn't it? You know, whenever you deal with such powerful systems, even if the justifications are somehow warranted, however you determine that, as you said, how granular do you get? And these granular decisions are exactly the no-win situations you end up with when you try and relativize binary issues. But yes, it does smell like what the proposed solutions don't seem to match the justifications, don't they? One of the reasons I think for that kind of confusion is the fact that we're actually dealing with two orthogonal, unrelated issues in one. So I agree, parenting is one of the most difficult jobs, especially doing it well, is one of the most difficult and rewarding jobs you'll ever take on in your adult life. And the world is filled with danger to a granular level that can never be predicted and legislated for. So yes, there are always dangers, and social media access is no different to the types of dangers that we were exposed to when the internet first came around. You know, in the late 90s, that was a brand new technology that ended up absolutely revolutionizing everything we do about relating to each other as human beings. Now we take it for granted, but you know, I remember a time when the internet was not a thing at all. That was a radical technological change that required a mature, grassroots approach to adoption. So the two unrelated things are, yes, there are things that we need to protect children from, but that in no way invites the conclusion that the state is the vehicle to achieve that. And I think there's this confluence, there's this temptation to leap from one directly to the other, and that's the domain of argument. That's where the battle needs to be won, I think. In my view, they're utterly unrelated and counterintuitive, but we just seem to have this narrative going where, you know, whether it's through the easy approach, or it's just, you know, you mentioned delegation before. I think there's a bit of that. But when you zoom out and you actually look at parental obligation, and I keep going on about the household and parenting, not because I happen to be a parent, but I think it's demonstrably the case that the family is the atomic unit upon which civilized society is built. You know, it's one of those fundamental building blocks. It's entirely appropriate to view the family as something unique that you assemble together in constructive ways that builds a functioning economy that we all want to participate in, and functional social circles as well. So I think we need to remove the temptation to jump to the solutions and the conclusions, particularly when they involve the state, and say, yes, we have all manner of problems and dangers, not just for children, but for adults as well. And that's our obligation, duty, and privilege to solve on the ground, as I mentioned with the Tobruk story. And just another little anecdote, I suppose, just on that. In my time in the Australian Army, that institution is built around exactly this concept So there are rotations. People are aware that you get assigned, posted to certain jobs, and then as soon as you come close to becoming competent in that job, they move you on to another location. And often it's in a different state, in maybe in a different corps, or the circumstances can be very different. But what tends to happen, and I've seen this on the ground, is you get fresh people coming in with different experiences, and you often get conversations like, oh, we had in my unit this exact problem, and you know how we solved it? And there's a battle-tested, on-the-ground piece of personal experience that then gets to be bespokely applied to the unique conditions where they're now being experienced. That rotation concept is actually by design, and we can implement a similar thing in our social circles as well. Parents talk, they discuss the problems at home, they can share what works, and that's really the best, lowest friction, best outcome way to all sorts of problems that we have with stewarding the next generation forward. And the state has no role in that at all.
So what's the best way to, map out, envision, whatever the word is, how verifying identity should operate, which works in terms of our own agency and privacy. We belong to ourselves. Achieves verifiable identification, because there are cases where you do need that, and doesn't allow the centralizing of identification data, and therefore from that, with programmability of all sorts of things, the manipulation of behavior on a mass scale to achieve whatever end. Is there a way of doing it?
Well, this is a fascinating question. I devote a whole chapter in my book to exploring some of the baked-in assumptions in that question. And when we talk about alternatives, what I think we need to do is really drop some of our baked-in assumptions. Now, one of them is that concept that identification is the tool for the job. Now, we happen to live in a society where it's just become so entrenched that it's, the mechanics of it are just an unfortunate reality of how we interact personally and kind of within the economy as well. But when you think about it, we don't identify for the purposes of identification. I'm sure you've experienced personal relationships, perhaps with your neighbour, where you actually have quite a degree of trust between you, but you may not even know his surname.
Yeah, I know really exactly what you mean. Yeah,
anything about him. So identification is not the end goal. We've adopted it as a stepping stone to trust. Trust is actually the commodity that we're dancing around here.
Okay, so it's like a just add water trust thing. Instant trust.
And trust is a very nuanced term as well. Like I say, my entirety of chapter 3 is titled Trust, and I talk about the different types of trust, how they scale throughout society, from the kind of neighborly trust up to the institutional trust, and how trust relationships have certain inbuilt control mechanisms. So you can have a very functional relationship with an individual or a business relationship without necessarily any identification. And it's the identification layer that brings in many of the risks. But as soon as you bake into the cake that we need identification to make our society work, then you're engaging already in circular logic. Because the whole premise behind digital ID is we're asked to, or forced to, trust unknown bureaucrats to verify unfamiliar people, so we're protected from the misconduct of strangers. It's a completely circular system that doesn't get to the level of trust that actually lubricates a functioning social or economic society. So it's actually quite a deep question you asked there. And what I do is I break down some of my thoughts on this in two axes. So there's a social component to that, and I'd say that's probably the primary one, because remember, when we build engineering solutions, we don't build them because they're theoretically possible. We generally build them to solve problems. The aircraft industry only exists because people want to travel. We don't build these things just because we can.
For fun. Yeah.
For fun. So if we start to shift the conversation more around what does trust look like in a society, then we can start asking the right questions about the technology that implements it. And the exciting thing there is all sorts of very well-established mathematics and implemented mathematics too, actual technical systems that implement a lot of these things that allow us to lubricate or develop trust online, where parties may not have even met anyone before, but have some sort of verifiable reputational history. So reputation is linked with trust. It's something that's
Actually,
very...
you just reminded me of something. Sorry to jump in, but
Yeah.
you did, and you mentioned aircraft. I was watching a documentary a while back, and it was on the first jumbo jet and the 747, which was huge at the time, as you probably appreciate, 1969. Anyway, the deal that made that go ahead was a handshake between the head of Boeing and Juan Trippe, the head of Pan Am. And it was a little piece of film of the secretary of Bill Allen of Boeing recounting the deal. The deal was at the desk. They both shook hands. The next phone call was Bill Allen calling the chairman of the board saying, "It's on."
We're doing this.
It was just a handshake between two guys who knew each other.
So that's a beautiful story, because it very elegantly articulates the metric that we should be optimizing for, and that's reputation.
Yeah.
Because that handshake was just the mechanical
Well, there was
implementation.
trust. The trust embedded in that handshake was world changing.
Yep, and what is unavoidably coupled with trust is consequences. So what held that handshake and that deal together was that mutually assured destruction sort of concept.
Yeah, they both go out of business.
The reputational damage that would be incurred by breaching that handshake was greater than sticking with the agreement. Now, reputation is a fantastic way to structure society. Firstly, it's largely decoupled from the very dangerous identification/judgment approach that we've just adopted willy-nilly throughout society. But secondly, it has some beautiful properties. For example, it's very difficult to earn and very quick and easy to lose. Now, when you optimize society for that type of metric, you find it somewhat self-policing. So you don't need... Trust is earned, it's not legislated. You don't need the powerful arm of the state to say you will comply with this. The beauty and elegance of this is, regardless of which whack-a-mole age assurance issue or problems we have with children, or whatever the particular details of the issue of the day is, you have this beautiful self-regulating behavior where people are very incentive-driven. And when they're incentivized to do the right thing and conduct themselves in honorable ways in their dealings, then that scales beautifully. And our technical systems then simply model how we've structured our society. That's what engineering's great at. We can equally use engineering to build weapons of war as we can these kind of privacy-preserving reputational systems that allow us to transact on the internet with people we've never met before, because we have...
I mean, we might be the arsehole of the world.
Say again?
A particular individual might be a total asshole. Oh, he's identified. He must be all right. No, so fast.
It's a poor proxy, isn't it? Yeah. Identification is not at all what we're actually after when we think about it. Yeah.
So, but there are other ways of doing it. There are the verification, two-step authenticity. There's all those things that we're already used to that don't need to go to a new level of biometric data being taken.
Well, absolutely. So even if you disregard everything that I've just said and say, well, we're going to take for granted that we're going to pursue this dangerous and ineffective path of identification as the lubricant for our society, even if you accept that, the irony is there are many commercially available models that prove that we can do it in a privacy-preserving way, and in quite the opposite way to what's being implemented right now, in decentralized ways. And you get all sorts of empowerment of the individual then. So there's an area called zero knowledge proofs, which I won't get into, but it enables you to selectively, as the owner of the data, release certain scoped pieces of information about yourself. So for example, I might apply for an engineering job, and it's appropriate for me to disclose to my potential future employer that I have some engineering qualifications. But I may not want to disclose the year that I earned that qualification or the institution that issued it. So you can get very granular. And because I own the data, I know exactly what I've revealed to the employer, and I can time limit it. I can revoke that permission and bring it back to me. As soon as you relinquish that to a centralized database, it will be copied at the speed of light. You'll never get custody of that back, and it can be weaponized against you. So all of this exists. We have working systems that prove that it can be done. So it really does beg the question, if the private market is already producing systems that are decentralized, avoid a lot of the pitfalls of centralized systems, and do it far more effectively and cheaply, why are we pursuing these extremely dangerous and expensive centralized technologies? As I said before, we're creatures of incentive, aren't we? Where there's smoke, there's fire. So something else is at play there.
Okay, so what is it at play? It's obviously to get people in some kind of digital identification space, whatever that space is, and it might be government, it might be private, it might be private public partnership. You hear about that quite a bit these days. But the driver for it, because when you have to have a society that's kind of falling apart to be able to justify the need for click your fingers trust, but we don't seem to be having a society that's actually falling apart as such.
It's a very relative observation, that one, isn't it? I mean, you could bring the boiling frog story. By some metrics, we are. By some metrics, we are well behind past generations. And one of the components to that is, as I mentioned before, the various pressures that families are under. The cost of living pressures, the fact that people find it hard to keep a parent in the home, to homeschool children and convey the importance.
Yeah, but a government, sorry to keep jumping in on your point, but the government can make those settings. In fact, that's what they're there for. There's an ability to redistribute wealth to a level where it's healthy for families to exist.
What's the right amount of wealth distribution? Because when you're doing that, you're disincentivizing those who create wealth when it's just redistributed further. But to your
spending billions on submarines or stuff like that, or sending it to Ukraine and having it go down a black hole.
These are not priorities when you're struggling to put food in the family plate at home. But when you're going back to your kind of motivations, to be clear, I think we're well and truly in the speculative landscape here, because we can't in good faith draw conclusions here, because we just aren't sitting at the tables where these discussions are being made. But we can make some very observable general comments about this. One of them is the nature of human identity data itself. So if you imagine, a lot of people have home security systems, those Wi-Fi cameras you stick up, and people put those security systems up for a reason. They point the camera at the areas of their life that they find valuable. So the front door, they want always eyes on the entrance to the house, or
the driveway.
The driveway, or access to the car. You don't buy these security systems and point them out in the backyard at the trees, because you don't find the trees valuable.
Hoping to get Bigfoot walk through the pictures.
Well, that's that's then a hobby or something. But the premise is we tend to observe and surveil that which we find valuable. And I think you can overlay that at the national level. When you walk through a busy city, you see a lot of these facial recognition cameras. There's a lot of kind of general public surveillance cameras. When you go through remote towns, there are fewer people there. That's the fundamental, distinction or definition of these remote towns, is they're less densely occupied. So when you look at what's actually being surveilled, they're human beings. So you can fairly easily derive from that human beings have value. And I walk through some of this in my public work as well. It turns out that humans are one of the most valuable resources they are. Human beings invent technologies, they build societies, they create wealth, they orchestrate social structures that allow us to pursue the best parts of life. We're able to create resources, we build businesses, all sorts of things. That's a very valuable commodity to monitor and surveil. And when you view humanity as a resource, I think some of the efforts to surveil and identify us kind of click and make a little bit more sense. It just, and regardless of what the underlying specific motivations are, if you're surveilling and identifying something because you view it as a resource, that introduces some very interesting conversations, doesn't it? Because who owns that resource? How is it extracted? And a lot of people might be familiar with the kind of surveillance capitalism and the business models that the big tech firms use to kind of monetize our behavioral data. So it's not really much of a leap to extend that beyond kind of social media and big tech and say, really all of humanity can be observed. And we see examples of this, in daily life. Boxers or professional fighters will observe video of their future opponents' previous fights, because the more that they can identify certain preferences, behavioural, tendencies, they favour a left hook, they can weaponise the knowledge of those behavioural traits, ultimately for prize money or reputational wins. So the more you know about someone, the more you can extract their resources and exploit them. And I think that's a very, very kind of easy to demonstrate principle that I think fits when you apply it at a national level.
When you're talking authority, the other thing, the overlap here with social media and the under 16 ban is with social media for everyone else. Social media is the new town square.
Yeah.
The MSM, well, we don't need to go on too much about that. It's clear where that's going in relation to social media. It is the town square. Authority is aware of that. And if you can get to this level of identity and tracking, then you can see who's criticizing you, on what platforms, when, who they're talking to, connected with. What are those groups? How do they interrelate? Who do they connect with? And you can build this picture, a battlefield overlay, let's say, if you're thinking politically and treating people like cattle a bit. You can then start to use that information to cut them off at the pass in that particular point, silence them over there, create a reputational issue for them over there. And that's, well, it's all scary, but that's a scary thing as well. If the Germans could have done it to that level in the 30s or 40s, they would have, right?
And they were very effective at it too. So
even with the punch cards,
you describe another very well-trodden path. So it's fairly easy to dismantle the ornamental justifications for this age verification. It's been kind of raised on just about every interview on this topic. The classic is, if child protection was actually the objective, why was Pornhub excluded, and all these sorts of things. I think that's fairly well established that is ornamental.
Yeah, but that's not where you have a political problem.
Well, yes. Isn't it interesting that the very platforms that best facilitate political discourse are the ones that seem to be targeted? And there's again, history doesn't rhyme, it sometimes directly repeats. So I quote in my book, I did years of extensive research from the online Buddhist archive. The Germans are excellent record keepers, and there are volumes and volumes of original 1930s and 1940s typewritten documents and reports on all sorts of very related topics to this, particularly about surveillance. Now, there was one report that I quote in the book from one of the Interior Ministry departments that discusses the nuanced handling of the occupied Polish population. Now, information control and selective allowance of information transferal was very much a topic of discussion. So back in the days, they had the equivalent was gramophone imports. Certain publications, so books is one, but also magazines. They were strictly checked at the border. But one very interesting component that I think dances around what you've been mentioning here is the fact that the German secret police identified that that town hall, and particularly in Poland, there were coffee shops. There were certain types of coffee shops that tended to be congregation points. And this report stipulated that should be permitted, because it's one of the few places that people with dissenting views actually come out and venture them with other parties, with resistance movements. And it was actually quite attractive to the regime that they could identify the areas where these conversations were being had, because sometimes letting them occur and surveilling them was far more valuable than just shutting them down. And I think there's perhaps a direct relation to the social media landscape we see here. It's being kneecapped a little bit, but still allowed, to go on under the guise of this identification now. So very much the opinions that we have in the old Polish coffee shops and now in the kind of global digital discussion spaces are going to be more easily attributed to our individual person. And that means that the political discussions we have will bleed into all other areas of life and may have implications with our employment or other relationships that are impossible to predict. So yes, it is funny, isn't it, how that seems to be one of those timeless engagements.
And it's training too for the upcoming generation to accept without thinking too much about it, because that's all we can remember. Providing information to create instant trust is probably what I'm going to call it now, when that actually is not authentic at all. But it trains people.
Absolutely.
Lowers the resistance, the friction against it.
That is a one-generation sprint. So these things change in one generation. And I'll give you an example. To many of us, to all of us actually alive today, it's inconceivable that you'd travel internationally without a passport on an aircraft. That's just one of those things, don't check your pocket for the passport before you don't question it. But there was a time when that didn't exist. But that's just theoretical now. We already have the generation where they perhaps have a theoretical understanding that once telephones had curly wires attached to them, and if you wanted privacy, I remember this from my childhood, the privacy I got on the home phone was I'd move around the corner, and when we got one of those long extended cables, I could get an extra 3 meters, and that was I love that autonomy, and I could cut my hand around, and now that's just completely inconceivable for the next generation. But what we do enjoy now is we all appreciate that we can get on a bus or a train, and as long as we've got a ticket, we comfortably travel to our destination. But to the next generation, it will be inconceivable to them in the same way that the passport situation is inconceivable to us now, that you don't identify getting on a bus. So there's nothing peculiar about that apart from the normalization, as you just described, of littering society with identification checkpoints. And once we've lost that, once you've got a generation that's just accustomed to showing all that identifies them and inviting the inevitable judgments that come with, then how do you reverse that? That's just a breeding ground for all sorts of granular.
Well, it's almost impossible. You can only reverse that if there's some kind of revolt, which hits some grand reset. Otherwise,
well, where's the motivation for the revolt when it's like trying to explain colour to a man blind from birth? How can you motivate someone to revolt against something that is all they know and is quite normal? It's only because in our generation we currently have people alive and active today who see the contrast. They understood what it was like to live without it, and they see what's happening when it comes in. But that transition is lost when that generation dies out, and you won't motivate a revolt when everyone is absolutely geared to the normalcy of those experiences. In fact, you'll find quite the opposite. You'll have people wanting to establish, wanting to continue the established status quo because it's quite uncomfortable to do otherwise. So these are very fundamental social changes we're staring down the barrel of, and the scope of time is quite narrow, unfortunately, for us to cup that hand around that flame of liberty as I describe and pass it forward.
So you've got young kids, or younger than mine. Mine are all grown up now. So I skipped this whole thing. It was DVD on, and The Lion King was about as intense as it got back then. How is your concept of managing their access into the space through these ages? I mean, how hands-on do you plan to be? Because if you're too hands-on, they're going to have a guts full of that pretty quick. So you probably need to be quite stealthy. But I'm just wondering, have you thought much about that?
Oh, look, absolutely. Thank you for raising this too, because it does raise another one of those baked-in kind of premises. Before I get into kind of my approach to this, we're all agreed, seemingly, that it's a foregone conclusion that kids will have connected devices with access to the cesspit of human knowledge on the internet. Why have we suddenly passed and skipped over that conversation? Because the absolute fundamental grassroots solution to the problem before it becomes one is to give children a childhood without that unfettered access to the world at large. As soon as that gate falls, then you're dabbling in the messy details. So it's an abject parenting failure to start with. It's gotten with us here. Now, I do appreciate that it's very easy to talk about principles, but principles are the very thing upon which we base healthy societies. As soon as you start carving out exceptions for principles, then you're in a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. So that's a nice segue into my approach. My approach to connected devices is no different, but it's principle-based, and it's no different to my approach to power tools. I don't have people coming up to me and say, how are you going to navigate that very difficult kind of transition into power tools? Do we ban them for under 16s? What if the parents give the DeWalt drill to their kids and they bypass the no one's talking about that.
Chainsaw. Yeah,
the chainsaw. No one's talking about that. But the principles are exactly the same. And it comes back to the statement I made before, when you accept that the state is the entity that can determine maturity and competence, you don't get competence, you get a system of compliance. So what happens when you're principles-based is you say, my job as a parent is to instill overarching, easy to demonstrate principles of moral structure. Some people use a religious framework for that. That's the most common one. Some atheists are able to actually navigate those waters without the structure of religion. But ultimately, you and I, I'm sure, don't wake up in the morning and resist the temptation to murder someone or steal from someone because there's a law against it. We understand that that's not who we are as people. And it's for those reasons that we pass those principles down. And I think the graduated and moderated kind of incremental exposure to risk is a very healthy and I'd say absolutely necessary component of raising a competent generation. If we're focusing and optimizing society for safety, which we very much are at the moment, then I maintain that's a subtle form of child abuse, because you are robbing the next generation of those skirts and brushes with the limits of capabilities that is exactly what is needed to develop a functioning kind of risk-reward sense in every aspect of adulthood that they'll come across. You need to fall off a bike and graze some skin off your knee, and what's more, get back on the bike to appreciate that you can overcome obstacles. And those fundamental principles in life, the parents have the life experience, and they also have the skin in the game. That's their flesh and blood that they're raising. And ultimately, if they do a good job, they'll be proud parents and grandparents down the track. There's a very juicy reward at the other end of that path. So, the same principles apply to social media as they do to power tools, as they do to any other kind of graduated exposure as appropriate to risk and reward that children will experience throughout their life. And as soon as you carve that out to the state, there's no that you're only dealing with problems and symptoms then. And the final point I'll make on that in terms of my approach is it is useful to motivate children, as it is adults, in the appropriate way. As I've said a number of times already, we're an incentive-driven species. Now, I'm sure you've found, Paul, in your life, some of the things you've probably succeeded most at are the ones where you've had an internal desire, you've had a goal.
Totally.
And there's been some internal motivation. And often it's not achieving the end goal that's ultimately the reward. It's the fact that you wake up every day and you can see incremental improvements in your competence as a direct result of your tenacity and effort. Now, that I maintain in my life as well is one of the most valuable experiences I have, is when I can point to some writing the book is a good example. Joining the army is a good example. These things can't be bought or rushed. They're achievements that when people look at them, including yourself, you say, I earned that. And that's a badge of pride that will put a spring in your step through your whole life. And when we outsource these sorts of things to the state, we are also robbing children of that ability to fall off the bike and be proud of the fact that they got on it, or ignore their parents and then understand why the parents kind of warned that. These are all success failures. Failure is a necessary precondition for success. And so this is why I very much maintain that age identification and digital ID is almost very secondarily a technology question or even a legislative question. It's fundamentally a philosophical and social question. And I think a lot of these problems go away, and others, when we start to view it in a more kind of principled and moral framework.
The book, you can see it in behind you just there, Citizen One, The Case Against Digital Identity. Where can people get to that book, Paul, quickly?
Yeah, so I sell it myself. It's at my website, paulgconlon.com, but appreciate for international buyers, they can also find it in any good bookstores, a print-on-demand global network, and you can just find it on Appies or wherever you buy your books. And I hope that it's very eye-opening for people in many of the areas we've discussed.
Great chat. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we'll talk again.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Paul. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Remember, go to www.realitycheck.radio/digital ID to say no to digital ID. That's where you can sign the petition.
Say no to digital IDs. Go to www.digitaltrap.co.nz and sign the petition today.